Okay, people, here we go. We are on. So, I wanted to dive in without a life jacket, jump off the plane without a parachute here, and just do a non-scripted unification of two ideas, if at all possible. It has been used as a argument from authority, which is a fallacy, by the way. Nevertheless, it has been partaken in many times when you see in debates between Catholics and Protestants, especially when it comes to the doctrine of ecclesiology, and sometimes even soteriology as well, because these things really are connected in a very special way historically. And you will hear this phrase uttered, and you might not really understand the context. The phrase in question is, of course, Roma Locuta, Causa Finita Est, and it more or less translates to, I believe accurately, is Rome has spoken. The matter is finished. Now, some Catholics will use this and say something of the sort, well, you see, St. Augustine believed in the authority of the Pope, and he, through this phrase, is implying that the general understanding of the papal doctrines are correct, and therefore, if you like Augustine, you ought to respect what he's saying here. Now, sometimes the Protestant may respond to this and say something of this sort. I think that's one of the more common answers I hear is St. Augustine is not the final authority on doctrine. So if he did say that, which some Protestants do say that he wasn't quite saying that, I believe that's a weak argument, but a lot will admit that he did, but he's not the final authority. It's a fallacy to argue from authority, especially when, and even Catholics will admit this, St. Augustine is not the final authority of doctrine, whether on ecclesiology. Even though, of course, he is a well-respected theologian, he's deemed a doctor of the church by Catholics and Orthodox and Anglican, and I believe also Lutheran, conservative Lutheran circles, and of course by me. Now, I believe when it comes to trying to unify around this point, which I think we ought to do, we need to take the context into account. This is very important because one of the things I see in the conversation by those who often have not read the Sermon 131, which is where this quote is from, and even if they had read certain points of it, it seems that we're forgetting the context in which these words were uttered, and why someone as wise and devout like St. Augustine would use what is deemed now an appeal to authority. It's like, oh, well, the Bishop of Rome said it, the matter's concluded. Now, it makes Augustine look like a bad debater. Of course, this is a sermon, not a debate, but it does seem odd until you take the context into account. So I'm going to give a really rough history of two men, because there's two men who are premierly involved in this story, and of course the Bishop of Rome, who is Innocent the First. And we all love Innocent the First. Let's be honest, he was a great guy. If anyone can speak for the church, it would be Innocent. It's a joke. For my Protestant friends, it's just a joke. Don't get too offended. The two men in question are actually born on the same date, so it makes it very simple for us, because in 354 AD, both Augustine and Pelagius are born. And they live two separate lives, almost completely opposite in the way that they end up going. So Pelagius grows up in a Christian household, and Augustine has a pagan father, though his mother, Saint Monica, is a extraordinarily devout woman. They take very separate turns. Pelagius goes into the monastery and immediately becomes well-liked, very articulate, very winsome, if you will. And that's not me just saying that. He was a very winsome guy. He was very good at winning people over to his side. He was very elegant. Augustine, on the other hand, spends his childhood in abject degeneracy. These people could not be more different. And not to go into a biography on both of these, one of the things I think that could be pointed out is their awareness towards sin as it is shaped by their upbringing. So Pelagius is a guy who was protected from a lot of the ills and vices of the world, and I believe that very possibly led him to a superficial understanding of his own depravity as well as the depravity of man in general. Whereas Augustine, not being baptized as a child, not being brought into the church from a young age, had a first-hand taste of the kinds of depravity which his heart was able to muster up out of his own nature. So, it's very important in the conversation, as you know, after St. Augustine becomes the Bishop of Hippo, his wonderful conversion story, we're going to just gloss over that for now. He is teaching, leading in Hippo, very well respected. And some of the followers of Pelagius come in and begin to stir up these kinds of arguments. There's a couple of them. I think a lot of my audience knows what Pelagianism is, but there's this idea that man is not completely bound in sin in his entire nature, that there's a part of man's nature which is freely able to do what is right in the eyes of the Lord. There's this ideology that if God commands something, that necessitates man's ability to perform it. Pelagius argued this. Other heretics in church history argued this is a common heresy that crops up. It's very logically based. The problem is it denies a central point of the gospel, which Augustine argues for, especially from the Pauline letters, and that is that it is only by the grace of Christ which man can come to God. His nature is incapable of performing the great acts of virtue which the Lord has required, which is why the Lord provides grace and the Spirit. And I'm oversimplifying, of course. I'm just giving a foundation so that we can understand the context of this great phrase. Now, these things are debated for years. Pelagius led many astray. Again, a winsome guy, very devoted to his craft. His followers were devout. And so lots of people were won over to this false and heretical idea. It basically was a denial of original sin, which is a dogma of the church. And again, Paul makes it very clear that there can be no real understanding of grace without the idea of our sinful nature. So Augustine is arguing for the Pauline doctrine. He is arguing for the gospel. Pelagius is seeking to subvert it through his own wisdom and understanding. And again, Pelagius was very wise. He was very winsome. He was very learned, but he was wrong. And so the debate goes on. It goes through letters, which we have. It goes through a lot of open speaking, a lot of teachings on both sides, a lot of letters on both sides. Eventually, it is brought at first actually to Pelagius. This is interesting. Not a lot of people know this, but Pelagius appeals to some local bishops around Augustine, and they take his side. He wins them over through his eloquence and his fairness of speech. And they kind of are now resisting Augustine to some degree and suppressing his writings because, they're more or less on Pelagius' side. So Augustine does what he must do. He appeals to, it is at the time Innocent I, Pope Innocent I is the bishop in Rome. He sends a letter to Innocent. Innocent looks over it, and long story short, he deliberates back, and they take Augustine's side. They stand up for truth, they stand up for the gospel, they stand up for the biblical message and say, this is the ancient teaching of the church, this is the teaching of the gospel as it has been understood, and Pelagius is in denial. So, very important moment in church history, as any historian would point out. But in this, the controversy is not immediately snuffed out. You would like it to be, right? You would like it to be that, okay, Augustine, one of the greatest theologians, Innocent, one of the greatest leaders in Rome, have come together, as well as many other bishops, many other theologians, and they've done the history, they've done the work, they've done the study, and said, yeah, this is the gospel teaching, this is the ancient tradition, and Pelagius is wrong. You would like for that to be the end of it, as it ought to be. But it wasn't. Pelagius dies, and his followers are more persistent still than he was. We don't know if Pelagius would have repented. We hope that he might have. But his followers didn't. His followers didn't submit to the sound biblical wisdom of Augustine or the teaching authority of the church. And this is where you have this great phrase, where Augustine is reflecting upon the controversy in question and deliberates this idea, which I kind of just expressed before. It should be finished. So Roma Locuta, Causa Finita Est, is that we're not going to rehash this issue. The matter is finished. Now, what can we learn? I hope that I've deliberated on the context a little bit. By the way, eventually all of Pelagius's followers are suppressed, and the Orthodox teaching reigns in the church for a very long time in the medieval period. It does crop back up here and there, but it has to be suppressed. You see this in some of the cults which rose up kind of in the Italian region. No, it wasn't Italian, it was Spain. My bad. Getting my history mixed up. But there were some Spanish people who denied original sin and taught total perfection of the body. And, they were suppressed. And, of course, we know the Armenian controversy after the Reformation just brought this out in full swing. And now we're all Pelagius. We're all heretics now. We should all be executed. Now, with that being said, what does this tell us about authority? What does this tell us about the church, about the Pope, about Augustine's teaching authority, about Pelagius? And here's what I would like to present, if I may, and I will weigh it by you, because I think it's a very balanced and unifying idea. So Innocent is sitting as the Bishop of Rome, Innocent I, and Augustine is more or less one of the most renowned and notorious teaching men in all of church history. He is very influential, possibly as influential as the Apostle Paul, maybe only second to the Apostle Paul. And so you have this idea of authority abstracted from the context, which I believe not all, but some Catholics seem to misunderstand, not knowing the context, but relying upon the authority only. And then sometimes you have Protestants, which rely heavily on the context and dismiss the tone of authority, which really and legitimately is here. What I would like to argue, and using this as a jumping board to the context for what I believe is going on here, is that the Pope, in this case the Bishop of Rome, and St. Augustine and these people who agree on these doctrines do have absolute binding authority. And I believe that's what Augustine is talking about here. The stipulation of that authority is that they are correct. This is why Augustine, relying upon the biblical message which he had argued for years, relying upon the ancient tradition which was manifestly demonstrated to the advocates of Pelagianism, finally he relies upon the church, which upholds the biblical message. It upholds the ancient tradition, and Pelagius does not have a right, he doesn't have a right to deny the Bible. He doesn't have a right to deny the ancient tradition. But if he goes so far as to misunderstand those things, he certainly does not have a right to deny the real and actual authority the church has to uphold the scriptural teaching on these topics. I believe that's what's going on here. It's not a fallacy of appeal to authority without argumentation, as though the authority is your argument. I believe what Augustine is pointing out is that the argument is from God. The argument is from the Bible. The argument is divinely revealed to us about man's nature. It's also, he used a lot of logical arguments. It's logically true. You can see this. Augustine talks about this inside of his Confessions, about the logical argument for man's sinful nature. Very interesting. Highly recommend reading that if you haven't before. But at the end of the day, if you can't see the logic, if you can't see the biblical argument, you still are obligated to obey what the church has spoken. Maybe you can't get it, but it doesn't matter. The matter is finished. These things have been deliberated upon. These things have been argued for and looked over, and the church has taken her stance for a reason, as it were. And so I really think that the church being referenced here, particularly the Bishop of Rome, is really just demonstrating, I believe very well, why God gave us a church, as he says in Timothy, as the pillar and foundation of the truth. Because truth is always going to be attacked. It's always going to be misunderstood even by the genuinely wise. And therefore, there must be an entity on earth which upholds that truth above all else, which is willing to throw out great winsome men like Pelagius who deny it. Even our own friends and family are not able to go against the truth. And God gave us an entity to uphold that truth. That entity is the church, the Catholic Church, the visible church of God. Of course, the church need not be upheld in heaven because we are all perfectly united in wisdom and understanding to that truth. But on earth, where it will always be assaulted, where there will always be people who come back with the same tired arguments which have been defeated time and time again, as Augustine is with Pelagius, you don't have to reopen an argument on something like the Trinity or original sin or these great ancient dogmas of the church. I think we ought to, as Protestants in particular, utilize this Augustinian motif more inside of our conversations with heretics. Heretics want to get you arguing for something which has already been defeated. They want to bring up superstitions and false ideologies and vain traditions, which have already been abolished by the gospel, by the scripture, and by the church of old. And I think we should rely more on this idea of Augustine, where it's like, I don't need to argue all of these things to you. I don't need to make a perfect and most elegant defense of the Trinity. I'm not qualified to. The church has spoken. The matter is finished. I would like to see us learn from Augustine here. No one I know alive today can argue as well as Augustine did. Very few are as skilled as he was, as knowledgeable of the ancient church, being that he was a part of the ancient church and he knew some of these people who established our great ancient traditions. He knew the people who were at some of the people who proceeded from those at the Nicene Council. He knew these things better than anyone who's alive today, and yet Augustine did not feel the need to always make the argument for it. Sometimes it is enough that the church has spoken, and therefore the matter is settled. I believe we have a lot to learn from this attitude, this reverence, this dignity which God granted to the church, and men like St. Augustine recognized it. Okay, now that I have fixed all of the division between Catholics and Protestants, we can all live happily ever after. And with that, for those who are in Christ, the Lord be with you all.